All right. I guess we're live. Welcome back, everyone, to the American Prospects Weekly Roundup show, where we have folks from the Prospect and elsewhere on to discuss the events of the week. Unfortunately, my boss, David Dayan, is indisposed, and so you're stuck with me once again. But luckily, I've got a much more interesting guest than myself. Evan Urquhart, am I pronouncing that correctly?
It's just Urquhart.
Urquhart. There we go. It was a pact I signed with a demon at the crossroads out in the countryside that I have to mangle at least one person's name every time I do a podcast or a live stream. But anyway, th Evan, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, I think that's good podcasting luck, actually, to mangle a name at the beginning.
Yeah. Um, anyway, so you have your publication assigned media, other freelance work you do from time to time, and you focus if viewers aren't aware on trans rights and all the various implications of that. And I wanted to have you on because this last week or so has seen just a culmination of the assault on trans rights kind of that's built up over the last, I don't know, decade or so. And we could start with this Supreme Court decision, U.S. versus Skeretti. Everyone, assumed it would go the way that it ended up going, but so the basics of the decision are that, Tennessee has this law that basically bans transition care for minors. And that was sued, immediately, and it made its way to the Supreme Court, under the question of it being basically sex discrimination of some sort, which the court has held to be unconstitutional in the past. And yet, conservatives, 6-3 majority, they let the law stand. And so can you maybe start by digging into the reasoning and how the court kind of contorted itself to pretend like it wasn't doing, blatant, uh, uh, the Tennessee was not doing blatant anti-trans discrimination.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thread that I wanted to pick up just from what you said was that everyone really assumed that this would be the outcome. And, I've been thinking a lot about that coverage of oral arguments and kind of the run up and how, many of the headlines were that even back in December that the court appears poised to rule in favor of these bans on gender affirming care. So I think the media did a lot of work to kind of lay the ground to make so that no one was surprised and to make sure that the conservative court experienced no pushback in really taking a law that very clearly said we want you know young people to appreciate their sex. We do not want them to be disdainful of their sex. We want to prevent children, in other words, from becoming transgender. Being transgender is a bad outcome that we, Tennessee, do not want. Um, the idea that that wouldn't be sex discrimination when the language is very clearly about sex and appreciating one's sex and not disdaining one's sex. It's really a leap, and the opinion kind of shows that. It kind of um, it Justice Roberts, writing for a kind of weird, cobbled together majority of the conservative justices, says that the law doesn't discriminate on either sex or transgender status. And what he's saying is that it categorizes based on age and also diagnosis. So, that the drugs um, can be used for any purpose except for the treatment of gender dysphoria. And even though only transgender people have gender dysphoria, not every single trans person has gender dysphoria. Therefore, this has nothing to do with sex or transgender status. It's just about a treatment for gender dysphoria. It's extremely tortured. It's extremely kind of convoluted logic. But they're the conservative majority. They get to do whatever they want.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to get into this the media background to this in a bit, but yeah, as you say, it's just an incredibly contorted and tendentious mishmash. And you can read the law as you say, and it just is straightforwardly discrimination against trans children, saying no, you can't have this because you're trans. Where if you're a boy and you experience what they call like precocious puberty, right? Puberty at like age 4 or something like that, you can get a puberty blocker. But if you're a trans person, you can't get that. It's just like a double standard. And I think the most disturbing part of it is how it kind of echoes the logic of um, Plessy versus Ferguson. And that was the Supreme Court decision, I believe it was 1896, which blessed Jim Crow apartheid with the infamous phrase "separate but equal." Because you're not doing discrimination, and so you're not violating the 14th Amendment because you're treating blacks and whites equally. Like black people are forbidden from intermingling with whites, but white people are also forbidden from intermingling with blacks. And so, see, that's fair, fair on its face.
Neither a girl nor a boy with gender dysphoria. So both trans women and trans men are equally discriminated against under the law, which makes it not looking at sex.
Yeah,
That's
I
kind
mean,
of
it kind of writes I mean, I think this is the intention of the law, like the decision almost. It writes trans people out of existence by saying it's like so we're treating, you know, assigned female at birth and assigned male at birth people the same. They both can't do the thing, and so therefore, but it's just like there's the category of trans people. It's just like you, by the way, by construction, you have no access to, legal recourse in this instance, and it's just yeah, Kafkaesque is the way that I would sort of come down on it.
Yeah, and Sotomayor certainly goes into this in her dissent, which is, there's definitely like a sex stereotyping, which is, it would be inappropriate for a person, a female assigned female at birth, to grow facial hair, for instance, like mine, whereas, you kind of can't avoid social sex stereotyping when you're saying like why it's not okay um for a person to have a treatment versus for a trans person to have a treatment versus a cis person to have a treatment. But I mean, I think it's kind of evidence of how normalized these kind of anti-trans attitudes have become, and how much I think being transgender is sort of implicitly accepted as a bad outcome that you would want to avoid and you would want to limit, which I think has
Yeah.
become more and more sort of a mainstreamed version of transphobic and anti-trans kind of attitudes, is that like limiting the number of trans people is an acceptable, like medical regulation that you could make here.
Yeah, yeah. Again, I want to get to that when we get to the New York Times. But before we get to the media, I want to talk about implications here. So one thing this definitely does is open the door to states. Many Republican states have already passed before this transphobic legislation attempting to restrict gender affirming care for children, and I believe there's some efforts to restrict it for adults too. In fact, that's another thing we'll get to in a second. But there's one specifically in Missouri that is coming up. You wrote a piece on that. Can you explain what's going on there?
Um, Sorry, can we the piece I wrote on Missouri would have been which now? Remind me.
Let me look it up real quick. Uh, Maybe it was for, oh, this was by somebody else. Sorry, I didn't check the byline. I mean, maybe we could just talk about the state, like what's going to happen in states in general, across the country, red states, now that the court has blessed this sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, so certainly we have already had um, you know, families terribly impacted by these bans. So because the court had allowed the laws to go into effect in many states, there are children who relied on these treatments, who were, doing really well and were well supported by their families, whose families have had to drive hours. I know a family who flies hours from Texas because Texas is a very large state. You can't just cross the border in a lot of Texas to continue on treatments that have been working for their children. I think families in some of the worst positions are families who hadn't, established treatment before these bans went into effect. So, they're trying to, establish a relationship with a team and get assessed and go through these very lengthy, very kind of difficult processes that have been, falsely portrayed as being quick and easy. In reality, it generally takes months with the therapist and an extensive assessment before kids are able to be approved to start these medications. So families who are at the beginning of those processes have a very, very high burden if they have to, if they have to get treatment out of states. And this is also, of course, why many families have sort of left these red states. Um, and had to kind of move and find ways to make it work in another state um because these are necessary treatments and because you know if it's between getting your child treatment for a condition they have and just letting them go on treatment that treated that doesn't really feel like a reasonable option for many of the families in this situation. So
Yeah.
the ruling itself, I mean, has in many ways kind of established that as, something that's going to have to continue. But I think that people have a lot of concerns about the knock-on effect for some of the executive orders that are, the federal government has been sort of engaged in this kind of increasing pressure that they've ramped up on clinics, even in blue states. There are centers in blue states that have limited care already or that have made moves to limit care, and then kind of backed away from them. And then, of course, also these clinics in blue states that are open are increasingly overwhelmed because they have a flood of people from other states that are trying to access care. So it's a really terrible situation that is looking like it's going to get worse for these families.
Yeah. And the last thing on this decision, you had a piece, I think it was you, about like the broader implications for care other than for trans people, for like vaccines or female care for mothers, and so on. Can you get into that?
Absolutely. One of the one of the things, I'm not a lawyer, but one of the things
Right.
I had been told to look out for by the lawyers um, was this particular case, Geduldig versus, oh, it's something county, Clayton County, I think it is, which was a decision back from the 1970s where California had had sort of an insurance program for workers who experience disability, but it said, the that not every single condition was covered, and that included like substance addiction and I think it was like kleptomania or something, and pregnancy. And the Supreme Court determined that it was not sex discrimination to um, to exclude pregnancy from your list of disabling conditions that workers were able to get um, insurance coverage for. And, um, it has been considered a stain on the court and a stain on equal rights law pretty much ever since. And many people had considered it sort of dead law, had considered it something that hadn't ever been overturned, but was sort of completely outside the consensus of what constituted sex discrimination. And this this argument by Justice Roberts very heavily leaned on this idea that medical condition wasn't the same thing as sex discrimination, even if it was only present in people of one sex or otherwise would seem to classify based on sex. So this kind of there's actually I think a federal law that protects against discrimination against pregnancy in this particular way, but birth control, um, any kind of other healthcare for that, that impacts women but not men. Um, all of that is kind of back in. So that's one of the ways that I think this could have really serious implications um, beyond just trans people. And then the other way that it could have really serious implications has to do with how um, the propaganda efforts to sort of raise questions and raise doubts about transgender healthcare plays into the sort of larger war on science that the Republicans have been engaged in. So, although the court has kind of long held that, a rational basis review is a very low level of scrutiny and that most, laws would sort of pass it. It really is opening. So the ACLU had argued that this law didn't even pass rational basis because it is claiming to protect children who it is actually hurting. And so if you looked at kind of the facts of, the medical evidence, that would be, obvious. And so it's not rational to pass a law that you're saying is helping trans children when it's actually demonstrably hurting. And, kind of the problem there is that the Supreme Court has sort of said, like, it's really not for the courts to look at this medical evidence at all. The fact that there's some controversy in the science is enough for us to conclude that the courts should stay out of it. And when you combine that with the places where there's kind of controversy in the science, all of a sudden, that absolutely sweeps in vaccines. That absolutely sweeps in, because you can kind of create a controversy through this political means and this sort of propaganda tactics wherever you want. So, suddenly the science of asbestos is back. Is a controversy again. Suddenly, the science of vaccines is a controversy again. And if there's no place for the courts to say this isn't really a controversy, the science is what it is, and all of this is kind of you know, is kind of nonsense, is kind of is kind of bad faith efforts to raise questions where there aren't really questions. I mean, I think it's a problem even if a court had looked at the evidence but said, okay, we think this passes rational basis, we would be in a better position than we are now in terms of some of these other impacts on vaccines or other kinds of scientifically contested area, because the court's saying you shouldn't even look.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, there is going to be, I'm sure, it's a case on vaccines because Robert F. Kennedy Jr., I think, is pretty clear he's going to try to take them all away from you and from your family, and it's going to be based on crackpot nonsense. And I'll be curious to see if it gets a hearing in the New York Times, like the crackpot nonsense on trans people that has gotten a hearing, has been spread widely by the New York Times. Not only them, but I think, maybe with the exception of the Atlantic, has been the most important spreader of transphobic talking points and misinformation over the last several years. The I saw this. Erin Reed pointed out in her Substack, and I went to double check that yes, the New York Times was cited 7 times in the Skeretti decision, every time in support of one of their goofy arguments. There's one about raising questions about the dangers of puberty blockers. There's another one, the classic detransitioner article by Pamela Paul saying like, oh, like all these poor detransitioners, the people that they were basically bum rushed into trans surgery or hormones or whatever, and that was such a tragedy. And as you were saying earlier, back of that is just straightforward transphobia. This is like taking as an assumption that becoming trans is bad, nobody should do it. And here, look, here's a handful of like people. Most of them are like political activists, because I think you've mentioned before there are a lot of detransitioners who are like, it didn't work out for me, but I don't have any smoke with anyone else trying it. That's none of my business. It's just this handful of people who've been plugged into the right-wing machine. There was also The Jamie Reed story from the, I believe it was the Missouri clinic, where she basically did a op on these people and came out with a bunch of complete nonsense, asserted that the children were saying they identify as a helicopter and basically were like shot with hormones with a dart gun, after no um, checking or counseling or anything like that. And yeah, so like the Times is implicated in this decision and a lot of other quote unquote liberal media. They were central participants in creating a permission structure for the court to do this, a sort of fig leaf that they can build the argument, the decision around. We've seen the same thing happen in the UK with that Cass report thing. So can you talk a little bit about this? The centrist liberalism's kind of like attachment to transphobia and their role in whipping this whole moral panic up.
Yeah, I mean, you've really said it. A lot of it. I think yesterday the New York Times ran six different pieces about Skermetti that really felt like a victory lap. Like that they were almost
Yeah.
shouting, "We did it, guys." We got these trans kids' healthcare taken away. And of course, they blamed, trans activists for pushing too far, for asking for too much, and it just basically said, you know, it's all their fault. It's definitely not us, with an almost undertext of glee, that this decision that they had predicted, came to pass, and it has been years now of increasingly mainstreamed, confusion and questions and obfuscation around, um, some of the basic science on this issue, to the point where it does feel like the conventional wisdom now is kind of almost a where there's smoke, there's fire feeling, that there must be something wrong with this healthcare that, I mean, I was writing about this on Blue Sky the other day, but I kind of constantly go back and kind of check my assumptions because I am not I'm not a bomb thrower. I'm not a radical. I really think of myself as a very kind of careful, follow the science guy. And when everyone is saying something, you do kind of wonder, like, well, could I have gotten it wrong? And I come back to, the Cass report, which was a review of, the gender affirming care, gender clinics in the UK. Uh, in the appendix of the report, it says, oh, only a third of patients were actually referred to endocrinology for like more medical treatments. But we have decided that they were rushed into it. And it said like, oh, out of 3,000 patients, we only found 10 detransitioners. But again, this is a serious enough concern. And so you look at what they found about the clinics and the care, and then you look at what they concluded, which is like there's not enough evidence to be sure that it's good. And so there's this disconnect where, you would think that if people were being rushed into care and experiencing harm, you would see a lot of evidence of that. You would see, more than, well, we still don't know yet. We're still not sure. It still might be happening. We're concerned it might be happening. So we need to limit care. And, the move that the Republicans pulled, which isn't just we're concerned it might be happening, so we need to limit care, but like we're actually just going to ban it and sort of be like pretty blatant about we just don't want trans people to exist, and we don't want, you know, young young people to be encouraged to understand themselves and to be able to be, comfortable in a trans identity. We want to make it as uncomfortable as possible for them, has really been enabled by this constant raising of questions, suggesting that something might be going wrong, suggesting that there might be more harm than we know, suggesting that the benefits we've found haven't been established clearly enough, so that, so that there's kind of been a permission structure um, for this care to be taken away and to be limited. And I think it's terrible. I mean, I think it's going to hurt a lot of people for a really long time. And I do think we're probably going to talk about concerns about adult care, but I mean, I do think that's very likely next.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely do want to get to that. Um, but yeah, before the, Before we do that, I think it's always just sort of going through the basics because people get so wrapped up in the in all this, tens of thousands of words of the just asking questions. Oh, here's a detransitioner who had a bad experience. But you look at the science and it's pretty consistent findings. It's like number one, trans people are quite rare, something like 1% of the population. Detransitioners are quite rare. You're talking about hormones. I saw a couple of studies, something, between on the order of 6% to maybe 30%, depending on when you count. You look at the rate of gender confirmation surgery regret is about 1%. Um, and like everything in American healthcare, it's difficult and expensive to access. You look at Tennessee, Michael Hobbs pointed this out on Blue Sky. It has one pediatric trans care clinic. They do 5 surgeries a year. We're talking about a tiny minority of people. And it's like, why are you so obsessed with this? And the reason is transphobia. They don't like them. They want them back in the closet. And even you can look at it from the other end of the telescope, say like, what's the most common surgical procedure in this country? Knee replacement. I believe that's still true. It's been true for years. What's the regret rate on knee replacements? 10%. This is major invasive surgery and it's risky. And sometimes it doesn't work out. Sometimes there are complications. And by the standard of, everything else in medicine, like, of course, there's some regret rate, but it's quite low.
Well,
And
one of
um,
the pieces I've been meaning to write that I really need to pitch is, the regret rate for trans surgeries is remarkably low compared
yeah,
to regret rates. And when we're talking about so you mentioned like 6% to 30%. So that's the number of people who have taken hormones and then
right.
for a while and then have stopped taking them. But if you look at regret, it's much lower. I mean, it is, again, it's
Sorry,
in
good
these kind of
clarification.
single digit percentages for regret. And when you look at, when you look at people who identify as detransitioners, people who say, I, believe myself to have a one gender identity and to think that, medical transition was right to me, and now I do not feel that way. It's a minority of people who detransition who say, and I regretted the steps that I took,
Yeah,
because many of them say, and I liked the changes that I got. I liked having a little bit of a lower voice. I liked having top surgery, but I don't feel like I wanted you know, um, to keep going to the point where I resembled a cisgender man. Or they say, similar kind of things where they say, I liked what I got, or it was really important to me to try it. It was a really important part of my process to like try this out, but it didn't turn out to be right to me. So the regret rates are so low that I actually think it would be a great piece that I want to write that's saying, like, what is trans healthcare doing right? Like, what is there
yeah.
about this informed consent process that is really helping people think through their decisions to a point where that you see much less regret in that area of medicine than in other areas?
Yeah, if I were to imagine myself as someone who is, in that kind of questioning phase, not sure, what my gender identity was, it would seem straightforwardly good that I could, mess around with hormones for a little bit and just see how it works. Like maybe I like it, maybe I don't. And even if I don't, at least I could check that off my list. It's like, well, okay, so, my issues weren't that. And so now I know, and now I can move on. It doesn't
I would
seem,
say, on a personal note, that is sort of what I did. I mean, I really felt that I really thought that what I was experiencing, this sort of hatred of my body, was gender dysphoria, but I didn't have a strong feeling of being one gender or another. And I thought, I could be wrong about this. Like maybe this feeling is just, maybe I'm kind of latching on to this idea that it's gender dysphoria. But I was like, I really need to know. Like I need to
yeah.
know if this feeling is that, because it was such a terrible feeling, and it was so amazing to think that there was any possibility that it might go away. So I started testosterone. It went away like completely, to a point where I almost couldn't believe that it had been so effective. And that's, I think, not to have that ability to say, I think this is what's going on and I think it might help me, but like I'm not 100% sure, is really what encourages people to lie to their doctors, to say, I don't have any doubt. You know what I mean? It can really create a very negative relationship with a doctor to say, you need to be all or nothing. You need to be 100% certain. You need to not only do hormones, you have to do hormones and then surgery. There's only one path and one kind of binary identity. And that's kind of the loosening up that has happened. The one kernel of truth in some of this New York Times coverage is that there has been a loosening up around gatekeeping, around strict requirements that anyone who starts hormone therapy needs to undergo sterilizing, kind of genital surgeries and stuff. Like the earlier regime was very stringent in that way. And, what they have found is that it works a lot better and actually, sort of like tragically leads to less regret if people have more of an open relationship with their doctor where they're able to talk through these questions, talk through their doubts, and that expressing a doubt or expressing, that you might only want to do hormone therapy but not surgery is not a reason to shut down the process. Um, and there's a lot of reason medically to think that that leads to better outcomes for patients. And that's kind of the actual question and the actual controversy that exists in the field is whether more assessments help or whether kind of they actually kind of harm patients' ability to have a rapport with their therapists or with their doctors. And I do think there's kind of a little bit of an open question there, but it isn't a question of does this help or hurt, and it isn't a question of um, have activists been too involved in the process? It's a question of does it actually improve patient outcomes to kind of lower some of these barriers and make it a little bit easier for these treatments to get to the people who need it?
Well, and on that point, there is research, if I recall correctly, that demonstrates like positive mental health outcomes and so forth for people who can access transition care.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, there's a lot of research in adults and there is a lot of research in children. Again, there was recently a new systematic review out of Utah. I think it's the Drug Regimen Review Center, and kind of all they do is try and look at the efficacy of different drugs for patients on Medicare primarily to try and keep down costs for Medicaid patients and Medicare patients in Utah. And so Utah had them, as part of their gender affirming care ban for youth, they said, let's get this drug regimen review center to look at gender affirming care for youth. And it's an extremely comprehensive review of the evidence on puberty blockers and hormone therapy specifically. And, what their conclusions was gosh, everyone seems to be saying that there's not enough evidence, but we really found that there's as much evidence or more compared to other pediatric treatments. And these are people who just do this kind of review all the time. And they're saying, I don't know what I don't know what the CAS review is talking about. Like there's tons of evidence here. And it really is, when you're holding transgender healthcare to a different standard of evidence than other pediatric care or than other healthcare, you can kind of find whatever you want. But if you kind of look at the question honestly, it just doesn't stand out compared to other healthcare.
Yeah, yeah. I guess doctors I've seen arguments going back and forth about whether it's useful to get a colonoscopy starting in your 50s, that might be worse than doing it due to the high rate of complications, especially as people get older. And yet, for some reason, there isn't this massive
Somehow they haven't
freak
been
out.
banned.
I mean,
Somehow we
I
haven't banned colonoscopies yet.
Yeah, because they're very lucrative for the profession. But anyway, that's a side treatment. We're getting sidetracked. The next thing I wanted to talk about was the big beautiful bill. Um, obviously this it's just a we're doing massive cuts to Medicaid and food stamps for the most part, so that we can fund big tax cuts for the rich, as well as an increase in the military budget and tons of money for ICE, so that we can have more masked, ununiformed, unidentified goons grabbing people at random off the street. But getting sidetracked again. And also, I actually only just learned this today. There's a massive attack on trans healthcare in the bill in the form of a ban. and here's where we return to the adults question. So first, I believe in the House version, there was going to be a ban on Medicaid paying for trans care for children, which would be huge because Medicaid covers like 40% or something of all the children. Huge fraction of the kids in this country. But now in the Senate bill, if I was reading this correctly, now that's all uh, trans people, adults and children, a ban on
Yeah.
Medicaid
So
funding that at all.
so I believe it's actually that the House bill late in the process changed the wording from only banning Medicaid from covering gender affirming care for youth, which was sort of bad enough, and they just took out the word youth or something to that effect. And
Yeah.
that was in the House bill. And so now the Senate is considering the bill, and it has this language in it that would ban Medicaid from covering any healthcare for gender dysphoria for transgender people. And um, I believe it is 37% of trans people are on Medicaid, which is a very, very high percentage because transgender people have so much more poverty, have so much more homelessness, have such high rates of family rejection, all of the things that are kind of protective, unemployment, all of the things that are kind of protective against poverty. Trans people are more at risk. So, of course, we have more poor trans people. We have more trans people who are on Medicaid. And it is very concerning. I mean, I think my um, editorial assistant, this amazing woman Valerie, who also does reporting for us and does writing for us, um, she called me last month and said, "I have an opportunity to get my surgery covered earlier, to get my surgery date moved up 3 months for the beginning of the summer rather than the end of the summer." And there were a bunch of things that interfered with plans that we had for Pride and stuff. And I said, take it, take the date, take the earliest date, they'll give it to you, because she does rely on Medicaid, and the Medicaid ban hadn't come through yet, and it hasn't been passed yet out of the Senate. But we have been concerned about efforts to target trans people, particularly the most vulnerable people who are people on Medicaid. Um, we've sort of seen this coming as a community for a while now. Um, and so, yeah, so the Senate is looking at this thing. And as I understand it, um, what we're hoping will happen, but which we really need people to be sort of, if they care about this issue, calling their senators and talking about this a little bit more, because there's an opportunity for the Democrats to raise the concern that this effort to strip trans people of healthcare is not financially relevant enough to, doesn't have enough of a financial impact to be appropriate for reconciliation. And, it seems likely that it would have such a minimal impact because trans people are so rare, and because these healthcare measures are such a tiny, tiny fraction of, like the budget for Medicaid. That if Democrats challenge it, there's a good chance it could be stripped out of the bill and require a 60, a 60% majority, or whatever, 60 votes to pass. But we do need Democrats to actually challenge it. And I think there's a lot of concern that there's a lot of interest that the Democrats are showing in kind of caving, and a lot of belief that kind of turning tail and running and throwing trans people under the bus will be the way that they win the next election. There's a lot of belief that that Kamala Harris, of all people, was so supportive of trans rights that that's what lost the last presidential election. And it's of course a fantasy, because Kamala Harris never said anything in support of trans people during the entire campaign, and the most she ever said was, "I will follow the law if the law says that that trans people need to be protected." But yeah, because there are a lot of Democrats who I think would love there to be easy answers, and like a very small minority that cutting loose could kind of fix all of their problems with motivating their base and with kind of being competitive in these elections. I think there's a lot of appetite to have this kind of easy solution, and I think it's why we're kind of seeing some concern that Democrats might not do the right thing and just trying to raise the question of whether this effort to punish trans people really belongs in a budget measure.
Yeah, this is your classic Senate bird bath, BYRD, to see if it comports with the bird rule for
There we go.
reconciliation. That th this is just a really great way to run a country where because you can't vote normally on anything. You have to use this archaic procedure that was not designed to be like the only way you pass laws. But yeah, for reconciliation, it has to be directly relevant to the budget. And you can't really smuggle things in there, smuggle like other like traditional policy priorities that aren't budgetary by just like saying, well, they have an effect on spending a little bit, and so we're going to do this. I looked up some numbers. Apparently, something like 275,000 trans people are on Medicaid presently. And I saw Caitlin Burns on MSNBC pointed something out. It hadn't occurred to me that if you're an adult and an adult trans person and you've had bottom surgery, you need your hormones to live.
Yeah,
If you don't have a primary sex hormone, you'll die.
yeah.
And so what this would do is make it so that the only hormone you could get would be the one that matches your birth gender. And so basically it's like detransition by force or die. And that's just a depraved thing to do to somebody. And you would think Democrats would be, you know, a lot of them, even Elizabeth Warren was kind of wishy-washy on this, but I mean, there's that famous poem by what's his name, Martin Niemöller, first they came for the communists and I was not a communist. So, and then everything worked out. I don't think that's how that poem goes.
It is, and I mean, I think you mentioned sort of almost in passing about, some of the context we're in with like, masked secret police on the streets, like abducting people and stuff. And I do think we should at least take a moment to say, you know, trans people are a small portion of the country, and the context that we're in is not, unfortunately, a context where we're the only people who are, having our constitutional rights sort of eroded by the day and having an authoritarian government sort of increasingly encroach and test the limits of what, can be tolerated by the public. We are a small piece of a larger story of a massive rollback of the rights and liberties that we have taken for granted for my entire life, since I, was born after the civil rights movement. Um, and it's just very dark. And I think that, the Democrats having some fight and having some vim and having some principle that, you know, that, you know, that these are rights, these are basic human rights that apply to everyone. And this is why the country, when it's at its best, has stood out. You would just really love to see more fight for on all of these fronts and more ability to articulate the ways that these fights are all connected.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I'm looking for in any kind of democratic leadership. We need a broad-based movement to, defend the idea of freedom and democracy. And so anyone who would throw trans people under the bus in a sort of Clintonite triangulation, I mean, that's unacceptable to me in general, but at this particular moment, you know,
It's not
we're
1990 anymore.
no, they're gonna carve us up like turducken. Just pick out, like Hitler and the Austria and the Sudetenland and then the whole of Czechoslovakia. That's what fascists do. We need someone with some spine, not like Governor Newsom in California thinking like, well, maybe maybe I'll win if I just, forget about, potentially tens of thousands of people being forced to detransition at the threat of death.
And
Um,
you see that Trump is weaker on immigration the more his cruelty and his lawlessness is highlighted by Democrats. And I don't think that it is a very difficult thing to connect The idea that trans people want to, live authentically in the way we choose to live to these basic American principles of freedom and individual rights to determine your own future. Like, I think that's actually a very easy thing to do. And and we just need people to be willing to say trans people deserve rights too. This is part of a broader fight where our basic principles are involved.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's all comes down 14th Amendment, equal protection. Everyone deserves the same rights and freedoms. And, it's you could imagine so making this sort of argument in a different context that I think a lot of the Democratic senators and the New York Times would not accept. Like, for instance, imagine we had a bunch of polls saying that gutter anti-Semitism is becoming very popular among Gen Z young men. And so what we need to do is triangulate on the anti-Semitism issue, and maybe Zionist occupied government people have a point. And would that be an appropriate response? I don't think that they would agree, and it would not be. That would be horrible. But it's the same thing with trans people. We're all fellow citizens, and it's just disgusting to even consider the idea that if we could win an election, maybe we can sacrifice our principles like that. But on the subject of disgusting, in our last few minutes, I thought we might talk about J.K. Rowling for a little bit. You were posting about Stephen Fry, who is recently, the British actor who did the audiobook for all seven Harry Potter books, if I remember correctly. And recently had some comments about her becoming just intolerable. Can you explain that situation and what it maybe reveals?
Yeah, I mean, Stephen Fry has not been someone who has been on the barricades for trans rights. He has definitely been the kind of guy who until now has really been saying, "Oh, we think there's probably something to it, poor J.K. Rowling is like really getting it from these activists who are going too far." And I don't know exactly what it was that caused him to be confronted with, kind of the reality, but the reality is that, that J.K. Rowling has been just absolutely, like her brain has just been boiled in acid with this transphobia stuff for years now. I mean, she has been co-signing some of the most extreme people. She retweeted this was back in 2023. She retweeted this terrible post that was saying, "Get your shit off my flag," showing the like black and brown stripes on the progress flag as like, I mean, just this like awful kind of like really the worst stuff. But she had sort of kind of first presented herself as just having some reasonable concerns and questions and had been very, careful in her language when she first began to raise this issue. And I think there were a lot of people who concluded that that trans people were overreacting to some sort of reasonable questions and concerns. And while I was one of the trans people who was like, no, this person's brain is totally cooked. She's got dog whistles all over. Like she's clearly deep in this. Like I could understand how people thought, and I certainly was never someone who was swearing about her, ranting about, like, but I could understand how some people might think, oh, I think maybe, people are kind of overreacting. But it's been years now that she's been like really deep in the kind of most fever, and she doesn't seem to post about anything else. And she's just extremely nasty. She's funding these, cases to try and make it unlivable for a trans person anywhere in the UK. And so yeah, so Stephen Fry kind of you know, went into the water and found out that it was wet at some point, apparently recently. And now he's finally allowed to say, the thing that has been sort of like really obvious to anyone who has been paying attention for a few years now, which is that, that she's just really out there and just obsessed with this issue and seething hatred in kind of almost everything she says about it.
Yeah, let me read off a couple of quotes here. He said, quote, "She started to make these peculiar statements and had very strong, difficult views. She seemed to wake up or kick a hornet's nest of transphobia, which has been entirely destructive. I disagree profoundly with her on this subject. I am angry she does not disavow some of the more revolting and truly horrible, violently destructive things that people say. She does not attack those at all. She says things that are inflammatory and contemptuous, mocking, and an add to a terribly distressing time for trans people. He later went on to say that until recently, he found Rowling charming, funny, and interesting until this thing happened and it completely altered the way she talks and engages with the world now. And I think that is I mean, as you say, Stephen Fry is not like he recently did a debate where he was on the same side as Jordan Peterson, right? Like he's definitely been sort of one of on that trend of kind of free speech, quote unquote, trans skeptical. Um, but
I mean,
one,
I want to say I'm a huge free speech guy. I
yeah,
think free speech, I think restrictions on speech always hurt the left more than the right. And so I always want to hold it down for free speech as an actual concept, not as a, cheap political
right. Of
catchphrase that's used to, but anyway, could go on.
Yeah, of course. No, free speech in the
Yeah, yeah,
sense that like it's very important for Milo Yiannopoulos to be able to go to colleges and harangue the students, but it's fine if the government is deporting you because wrote something on social media that they don't like.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think it's potentially a useful kind of indicator and maybe hinge, a route of attack to make in terms of trans rights because I think that a lot of people are very confused about trans. I mean, frankly, like I was kind of in this camp like 10, 15 years ago. I like, I had the standard sort of civil libertarian commitment that was like, it's up to everybody should be able to live the life that they want. But I didn't really have a great understanding of the issues. And I think that ordinary people can be vulnerable to this New York Times Jesse Singal kind of rhetoric of just asking questions, and you build up this sort of paranoia of transphobia, and um, but where it leads, maybe which is a kind of cynical reason to not be transphobic, but it turns you into a freak.
Well,
It just
I think that Stephen Fry is showing, and this is also my story, is that I was deeply uncomfortable with trans people for reasons that have later become clear to me. And I think one of the big things that sent me down the path of accepting myself was coming into contact with this virulent transphobia. And
yeah.
so all of a sudden, my kind of, sort of skeptical, um, my having taken on the belief, which I think is very mainstream and somewhat understandable now, which is certainly there are some trans people who are legitimate, but there are many, many more people who aren't, who really shouldn't be so foolish. And that was sort of for me, that was psychologically what allowed me to say, like, and therefore I will never transition or open this Pandora's box. But I think there are people who come by it more honestly than I did. And, it really changed everything for me to see how vicious the transphobia is if you stay in those circles for a little longer. And I think that's what happened to Stephen Fry. I think he, was able to maintain this, like, oh, they're going a bit too far, but I'm not really going to look into it mindset for so long. And then when he came into contact with how J.K. Rowling really is, it's like, oh, this doesn't represent me. Like I thought we all had the same reasonable concerns here. Um, and I think it sounds like you've kind of gone through that a little bit um on some level as well. And I don't begrudge anyone that, we all kind of take shortcuts on issues we aren't experts on. We all kind of assume that like where the center of gravity is in the mainstream is probably more or less correct. And it does take these kind of individual experiences with people to say like, oh no, this is actually really much more like the trans side is actually much more reasonable and much more science and evidence based than maybe I'd given it credit for.
Yeah, I think, there's two things that have happened, to me personally on my journey of becoming more woke. It was on the one hand seeing J.K. Rowling become just like I mean, destroying her career, like she was looking down the barrel of like 20 years of movie tie-ins and stuff, and I think a lot of that will still happen, but like it's really, really hurt her reputation among her core audience of, young progressive people who identified with Harry Potter as the sort of underdog. I mean, literally a guy in the closet. A lot of trans people, I think, have gotten a lot of comfort from that, sort of story. Um, and then at the same time, I met some trans people, and it was like, hey, you're just like anybody else, like, and it's like, well, of course, but like we all, we grow up swimming in the water, the culture we were raised in. I was raised in the 1990s, and homophobia was just absolutely rampant. For the all the most popular music and stuff. I remember it was top selling record in 1999. There's Marshall Mathers and LP, which is just like, yuck.
I love that. I also love that record
Yeah.
at the time.
Yeah, rural white kids couldn't get enough of it. But anyway, we're all on our journey here, and I think it's a useful demonstration for people who want to build allies for trans rights. Is that it's like, what are we even doing here? Like we've got all kinds of problems. What the ordinary family stuff where you're like taking the kids to school and going down to the pub and watching the game and um buying a new car, whatever, all the things that people do in their day to day. Trans people don't have anything to do with any of that. It doesn't matter. So like, why are you so freaked out about it? And that where it cashes out, as we're seeing right now, is whipping up a frenzy over something that's not happening, a complete non-problem to everyone, so that you can take healthcare away from 15 million people to make Elon Musk even richer. And it's like a time for sort of, I don't know, taking stock and be like, you're sold a bill of goods here. This is nonsense. And these trans people are just your fellow citizens. They're just regular people, and there's no reason to be doing any of this. And anyway, I don't know how promising that might be, how well it would work, but I think it's
Yeah, I
worth a
mean,
shot.
I do think that ordinary people in America, I would say in particular, we do have this culture of live and let live.
Yeah.
I lived in Tennessee and I lived in rural California, and you know, both times, particularly in California, there were a lot of people who like identified as conservative, who treated me great, who just really do feel that, as long as you're not hurting anybody, I might not agree with it. I might not, I might not entirely understand it, but it's not my business what you want to do with your body, what you want to do with your life, how you want to be called, and I think that they're like, I don't know how bad it's going to get for trans people before that basic kind of decency and desire to let other people do like take care of their own business reasserts itself. But I do have a lot of hope that it will, because I don't think we're a culture that likes to be up in everybody's underpants constantly, kind of meddling in what choices other people are making for their lives. And I think, I hope we're reminded of that soon, but I do think we'll be reminded of that at some point, because it's just really getting crazy, all this transphobia.
Yeah. Yeah, as a small government conservative and respecter of individual autonomy, what I like to see is when armed agents of the state are doing genital inspections at every girls' track meet around the country.
Like, come on, dude. Like, this is insane. Like, we did not have a problem with girls track meets. When we have a problem, we can address it. It's kind of the like.
Yeah. And that maybe as a closing comment, you see again with the focus on the girls' sports. It's just because that's the only argument they have that people struggle to deal with. And when you focus it back on, should adults and parents, with their children be able to make decisions about how their bodies should be? It's like the answer is obvious. It's none of the state's business. Um, but anyway, yeah, that's an hour. Evan Urquhart, thanks for coming on the show. Much obliged. Everyone watching should go and check out his website, assignedmedia.com.
Assignmedia.org. They should definitely
.org.
check it out. It's the best website on the internet, I'm pretty sure. I've been told. People are saying no, but if you want trans news, if you want to kind of get a little deeper on some of these issues, we've got some great writers. I'm back recently from a fellowship, so I'm writing again more, and yeah, would love people to check it out.
Check out that and check out prospect.org, the second greatest website on the
Yeah, no, you
internet.
definitely want to go first to Assign Media and then to the Prospect for supplementary non-trans content, which I hear people also like.
Great. Um, well, thanks for tuning in, everyone. We'll see you again next week. Same bat time, same bat channel at the weekly roundup. Bye bye.
Bye.